So thank you for inviting me here today to be part of the network. As Michael said, I'm Dr. Caroline Gard. I've worked in early education my entire career. I've moved into HE lecturing in 2009, where I've led various sort of undergraduate work-based early childhood degrees, most recently at Kingston University in London. And I've very recently, in the autumn, just joined Michael and his team at the Department for Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford. And that was sort of within a research role. So it's really exciting to be able to be here today as part of that team, and to speak to you about my work, my PhD research, which focused specifically on babies' rights in formal daycare. So today I want to speak to you specifically around the context of growing a culture for voice and agency in early relationships and early childhood environments. And I've obviously pitched getting it right for babies with the idea of us to think about rights and how they appear and how they manifest in formal daycare settings. And just to give a little bit of context for those of you that might not be familiar, when I talk about group-based care, I'm referring to formal early childhood education environments. So they are away from the family home. In England, typically these are day nurseries or childminding settings, which offer care for babies from 3 months old, usually between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m, sort of a variable between that, and 5 days a week as well. So there is always a mix of children in terms of attendance in those settings. There's also a combination of private, voluntary and independent settings, most of which are regulated by Ofsted, or if they're independent, then they're regulated by the Independent Schools Inspectorate. So, like I said, the title of the webinar takes us on a path of thinking about rights. I really want us to not think, oh gosh, is there something wrong with what's going on in nurseries and group-based care already, because there are so many strengths of the things that are sort of going on in the sector. But I want us to think about specifically where children and babies and children are positioned as stakeholders, and whether that is something that's achievable or is already happening in settings. So when we think about the strengths in our sector already, we have a really committed and passionate workforce. We've got very strong sector guidance in place, particularly across the whole of the UK, actually, not just in England, and a growing body of research that really does affirm the significance of early childhood education on a child's life. We also have really effective partnerships between families, settings and other agencies. Largely, they are effective in sort of most areas and most local authorities. There's also anecdotal evidence in specific settings that really demonstrate that settings have a real role to play in terms of developing strong relationships between babies and other babies, and babies and adults, and also positive learning space for babies to explore the world in a new way. So let's think about what the participation rights are of babies currently. And I'm just speaking about England. I know there'll be people sort of listening in maybe from other parts of the UK. And I just want to think about England at the moment. So what's the context for babies' rights in England? So the Children's Rights Alliance for England completed a report looking back sort of, well, in 2022, actually. And they highlighted some concerns. They highlighted that England is actually lagging behind other parts of the UK in taking forward children's rights obligations. And they claim that the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, in terms of ratifying and sort of embedding that fully across all pathways of society, is a long way off. There are examples in the UK, so thinking about Scotland, for example, who've really moved forward with babies' rights and children's rights sort of altogether. There's also other evidence to identify that actually there is a baby blind spot, which was identified quite rightly during the pandemic by the Parent Infant Foundation, but this remains quite acute despite various sort of new media outlets and kind of opportunities to speak about early childhood in a new way. I've argued within my work, actually, that I think this ripples through to early childhood education and specifically within the baby rooms in nurseries. And Peter Moss also has highlighted concerns over the over-regulation of early childhood services and sort of curriculums, which actually reduces the democratic potential for very young children. So there's lots of work to do, but equally, There have been some advancements, certainly in terms of research base across sort of cross disciplines, healthcare, universal care, mental health services. There's a real richness that comes through in the professional work that's going on with families. Like I've said, there's also sector advancements and things that we can learn from other parts of the UK and across the world. So in Scotland, they now have the Infant Pledge and very clear ratification of children's rights in policy, which has been groundbreaking in many ways. But there still is a gap between what research is saying and what is presenting and workforce knowledge in early childhood education settings. That could be attributed to sort of the quality of qualifications that people can access, and also the potential that's out there in terms of, or the conversations that have been going on out there around professional development opportunities stagnating for some settings and for some areas. There is also very limited and in some areas no opportunity for professionals to engage in a space for reflection on the work that they carry out with children. Positively, there is movement, there's government investment, nursery place investment for children from the age of 9 months old. But I would raise the question of who is that for, and are the babies' voices really being centralised in these new initiatives? So when I speak today about agency and voice, we're thinking about the fact that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child state that all children are entitled to express themselves and have their voices heard. They are also entitled to having rich, loving relationships and access to play, and also early childhood programmes which are developmentally appropriate. Voice is positioned as agency, but babies are only really empowered to use that voice through the responses they receive from others. So voice and agency are very closely intertwined, and simply having a voice doesn't automatically give you agency. Voices need to be seen and valued and appreciated and acted upon by those who love and care for children. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what my project and my research has been about. So hearing babies' voices within patterns of baby educator interactions in nursery provision was a funded PhD project funded by the Froebel Trust between 2018 and 2022, and I completed it in 2023. The stimulus to study was really around my own concerns, having worked in the sector for a number of years, around this marginalisation and potential sort of invisibility of babies' own contributions, not just in settings, but also in research. So the purpose of my study was to be really deliberate in drawing out babies' voices against the backdrop of typical baby rooms that you might find in day nurseries, which are privately owned day nurseries. Excuse me. So my study was unique in the way that it was one of the first in England, if not the first that I'm aware of, to really centralise the voiced contributions from the babies themselves. It offers a narrative and quite authentic in terms of providing a story of the 6 children that were involved. It was ethnographic in terms of its methodology and supported by a visual methodology, which meant I brought in the use of videos to really capture the everydayness of babies' interactions in the nursery. Whilst the study doesn't aim to represent all babies and all settings, it does have things that we can learn from. And it indicates that there's still substantial work to do to really centralise how babies' voiced contributions are really valued, not just within the sector, but beyond the sector. So the study recognises how voice is always suspended in the social context of the relationships that it emerges. So, for example, Decadadi and Han, they position babies as knowers whose voices are reliant upon the sensitive perception of educators, and how educators attribute meaning to those cues. And Penny Lawrence's work, she calls for further recognition of how adults and children's voices are integral to each other. So the research questions, there was 5 of them. And they're on the screen now. So what are the patterns of communication that babies employ to express their voice in nursery provision? How are these patterns of communication used to initiate and sustain interactions with educators in nursery environments? And how do the observed patterns of communication relate to parent descriptions with sort of from the home? And in what ways do educators respond to babies' voices in the settings? And do educators think the culture of the wider nursery environment influences their interactions with babies? And if so, in what way? So to me, it was vital to include parents, and it was vital to include the educators. And I'm going to talk a little bit more around sort of the methodological approach now. Within that is how do you conceptualize voice? It's such a contentious issue. There is so much out there research-wise that really makes us reflect and consider about whether we can ever capture the true voice of a very young child. So I learned a lot from my literature review. I also developed a theoretical framing, which was inspired by cultural historical theory, so positioning voice as a sort of a social construct, but also recognizing the importance of a relational history within that and how it is shaped. I also drew from Mikhail Bakhtin's work of dialogism, so thinking about the answerability of voice, and also the work of Frederick Froebel, who was integral, obviously, to my work all the way through, in positioning infancy as a period of time which we should value, and recognising that that voice really materialises in an active way in childhood. So voice in this study was positioned as a thread of connection, socially and culturally positioned in the relationships. It was intentional and motive driven, and it evolves in response to the space and time that it evolves as well. So voice was a simple and discrete movement, often without words, gestures, facial expressions and sounds, and silences as well. And it can be organised and distinct and narrative. I also drew heavily on Colwyn Trevarthen's work and the work of Jonathan Delafield Butt and Vasu Reddy as well. So thinking methodologically what the design was, so as I've said, it was ethnographic, and this meant that I actually went out into the field, into settings for 6 months in each setting. I made sure that the sort of theoretical frame really fed into the methodology in terms of ensuring that visual methods were really a central piece to generating data. I really wanted to make sure I didn't shy away from the kind of the philosophical and ethical issues that come with investigating voices of non-verbal and very young individuals. So I wanted to make sure that my methodology allowed for reflection. So field diaries were absolutely essential, as they are within ethnographic study. I also was incredibly passionate about ensuring the parents were involved in this study. So I had initial interviews with the parents of the children involved at the start of the study, really to learn more about the babies and how they present themselves at home. There was a mixture of visual and written detailed observations of the babies in setting. And also those videos were then used with educators, with staff, to really learn and to look at how voices were materialising and manifesting within the early sort of the everyday spaces of early childhood settings. So it was a combination, like I said, of naturalistic observations, and the video footage that I used was inspired by Kennedy's VIG model, which some of you might be aware of and familiar with. The observational data in terms of analysis was looked at through a cultural historical lens. So I applied Marion Hedegaard's research protocol analysis, and that encouraged a real triple aspect and perspective of what I was looking for. So I looked at it from the perspective of the person, the institution, and also society, and thinking about policy there. And that allowed me to really scrutinise the data and unveil some really profound insights that I'm going to share with you shortly. In addition, constructivist grounded theory was sort of embedded across a number of the different research tools as well, which really generated opportunity for new theory, new thinking, and new meaning to evolve as well. So in terms of the people involved and the settings involved, initially there were 4 settings that were recruited. Only 2 were fully completed data sets due to the pandemic, as I was collecting data from 2019 into 2020. And like I said earlier, 3 babies per setting were the focus, and up to 4 staff members per setting involved with those children were also involved in the study. So I wanted to say a little bit more about the model that I reconceptualized from Kennedy's work. So process that I wanted to support for staff was to learn more about voice and to really reflect on what voice looks like. So initially I carried out the initial training at the Tavistock Clinic to actually use VIG, so Kennedy's model, but I realised as I moved through that it wasn't going to be completely appropriate for a research purpose within the nurseries. So what I did was I reconceptualized her work, taking so much learning from it in terms of its strength base and the importance of really starting with the child and those real micro moments of communication. But I wanted to provide a dialogic space for the practitioners to really come together, assemble, construct, reconstruct and deconstruct all the things they were seeing in terms of within the baby's voice. It was important to me that it was underpinned by Froebel and also backed in dialogism as well, hence the concept and the use of dialogic spaces. I wanted to ensure that the strength-based was central, so I developed a cycle for the staff to work through with me to ensure that we were starting with things that were lighter or more positive in terms of viewing, so they could see really rich moments of interactions between themselves and the babies. And then we moved through looking at things where it was more challenging sometimes to see voice, where maybe it was more difficult to comprehend, sort of less visible perhaps to the eye initially. It was also very difficult at times for the staff to see some of the footage played back. So we spent a lot of time thinking about emotions and how we could sort of empower staff to move through that. Crucially, the educator said to me that it was a dialogic space that they found moved them out of that sort of rational and sometimes clinical environment you can find yourself in when you're sort of dealing with regulations and authoritative voices. They felt that there was new thinking that they had, and they also found that they really valued opportunity to see the children from a new perspective. The reflective space itself offered a new landscape. It was a place where they could reflect deeply and also ponder moments of connectedness with the babies. And significantly, they all said they felt they could slow down and just see the richness and the value of what they were offering babies in those moments as well. It sort of connected very closely as I was writing with Alison Clark's work around slow pedagogy, because they all mentioned it, and it's something that also comes up when we start looking at the voices of the children themselves. And crucially, though, what appeared to happen whilst they were moving through this sort of cycle that we've developed was a weakening of that authoritative narrative that kind of maybe led them to think that actually maybe this was the only way or the right way to do things in settings. They actually went back and felt that they could find time to be with children and maybe challenge some of the authority and the assumptions around organisation and tidying up, for example. And also they felt it was quite transformative for them. So obviously I'm not going into loads and loads of detail and showing you loads of the data and the footage of this, because I want to focus on the babies' voices, but just wanted to give you an overview of really how we generated sort of rich dialogue with educators as well. So here is an image from the data set. When we think about what we hope happens in nurseries for babies and for educators, this is, I think, what most of us might envisage. We certainly offer this perspective to parents, and certainly many government ministers would also assume that this is all the time an everyday occurrence. It was true that absolutely in my study there were some really beautiful, rich, strong moments of connection and sustained interaction, and the word sustained is really important here that we'll come back to, but sustained interaction between adult and baby, where they were both aligned and they were both responsive to one another. And there was really distinct evidence that, moved along too quickly, that babies and educators fostered strong bonds, but this only seemed to materialise when the educators were emotionally and physically present, and they were in the moment with babies over recurrent periods of time. And that was vital. It was during these moments where babies' confidence in their voice, the fact that they were being seen, they were being valued, seemed to stabilise. And their emotional responses were elevated. They had that sort of close connection. Being with special adults was very, very important to the babies, as it is to all of us. And in fact, they would spend most of their time in the nursery when I was sort of filming them, occupied with looking at the adults or waiting for the adults, and seeking to draw them into their worlds. But to achieve the moment like you see on the screen, that type of caregiving, it takes time, it takes investment, it takes educator knowledge, and support and increased training. Not just for the educators, in fact, for managers and also business owners as well. So moving on and thinking about what was actually the reality. This image is grainy, just to protect some of the identities of the children here. But the reality was that for some babies, their time on a one-to-one or their time in terms of sustained interaction with educators was very infrequent, and often the last thing to happen after organisation and tidying up, for example. So this picture depicts a more typical everydayness of baby room practice, which might be familiar to some of you if you have worked in settings. This occurred regularly across the 6 months that I spent in both of the settings. So babies did spend quite a lot of time on their own, without consistent or close interaction from adults. It seemed to be at times normalised practice to see educators struggling to balance the needs of 3 or more babies. And here, obviously, adult-child ratios in England are 1 to 3, which is favourable compared to many of our European peers as well. So in terms of sort of being recipients of fragmented and disconnected caregiving, there was often misattunement to their needs as well. But I would like to point out and really stress that this is not anything to do with the educators themselves. The more I was there, the more I studied, the more analysis and things that was going on. It was really very, very clear that the educators themselves were so passionate about being with those children. They loved it, they loved them, they loved the work that they do. But the issues were bigger than the individual. It was organisational, it was systems, and it was policy. And literally not having enough staff sometimes was one of the main protagonists at play. So the reality for life in baby rooms, it indicates that we've got work to do, and we need to think about, if we're in a position that's sort of visual on the screen at the moment, where are the voices of those children and how can we support them and facilitate voice to be a really positive and accepted experience as well. So let's think about the other findings that came through. So in terms of conceptualising voice, voice was used as a strategy to increase the presence and position in the environment. Babies worked hard at all times to establish themselves as a visible member of the community. As I've mentioned earlier, voice seemed to be dialogically threaded throughout the day. Whether that was kind of connecting with adults or not connecting, it was always there. And it was always used to reach out, but sometimes that was a silent contribution, which meant actually it was missed or completely lost in the sort of the busyness of the baby room. So one of the really interesting things that also came out was at times when you look at planning for baby rooms, or you're talking about conversations around children's care and education, the babies were actually seen as no different to the preschoolers, which raises questions because, as we know, babies are very different to a 3 and 4 and 5-year-old. So we just need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about evolving practice. As I mentioned earlier, there were times where babies were frequently left to occupy themselves and receive very little individualised or sustained interactions. And that's a hard finding and a big weight for me to share in terms of thinking about what that means long term, if that is normalised in the sector, which I know it's not in all settings. But interactions, when they did happen, were sometimes transient and fragmented, which means sometimes they started and then left and not gone back to, or not sustained, which is a really important feature as well, as we know, for children's development. What I did find was really interesting was that the babies who were younger, or the firstborn, so only child coming in, and also who had infrequent attendance patterns, maybe only attended 1 or 2 days a week, had less time with the educators and had less confidence to draw the adults in or to find their voice. So subsequently, that meant that their relationships took longer to establish, as you can imagine, But also it meant that they were frequently missed, and often just quieter in the group of babies. And like I've mentioned already, the institutional culture was underpinned by policies which maybe directly at the moment conflict the individual needs of babies and also the workforce as well. So I just wanted to quickly move through the distinct modes of voice that came through with some imagery as well, just to support the sort of you visualizing this. So voice was very much a chain of connection and communication. It didn't matter the age or stage of development of these children. Every single baby that I observed went through this stage and these phases and dimensions. Even if it was very quick, and sort of slowing down video really helped with kind of identifying those moments. But they all were committed to observing and sort of surveying where the adults were at all times. They then, within those moments of watching, demonstrated quite distinct facial expressions, obviously very distinct to them as individuals. There was a physical movement always in the direction of where they were looking. And that comes through, you see that in literature from Colwyn Trevarthen and people that speak about that, the importance of reaching out physically. The older children who were able to move also engaged external objects as a catalyst for a response. So, for example, one of the boys would always pick up other children's flasks and move them around the room and hand them to an educator. Now, what was really distinct for all of the children was that if they went through the first four dimensions, and there was no response from an adult, or very kind of minimal response because maybe they were busy with other children or busy doing other things, it always moved into a cry or a sporadic vocalization. So if they were immobile, so they were maybe in bouncy chairs or kind of not able to crawl yet, they would cry for long periods of time until the adult responded. The older children, you would often see sporadic vocalization, so shouting or screaming, which then obviously was positioned by the staff as being quite annoying and was challenging to cope with and to deal with. So these are important findings for us to start thinking about the education of staff, but also for our thinking around how unique voice can be for babies and how it looks very different for every child. So here is the findings which you might say, well, that's obvious, of course that's the case. So the findings in terms of voice was voices of the babies were completely enriched by spending sustained time with the adults. Their social confidence and emotional regulation stabilised. And what I found was the voice chain of communication was very interconnected, and there emerged kind of tenets of humour and playfulness and laughing, but only when those adults invested time and were emotionally and physically sort of present. And you might think, well, that's not groundbreaking. Of course, we know this. Well, there's been oodles of research and sort of out there for many, many years that have said that this is the case. It's not revolutionary. But what was sort of important coming out of this study was the way that the voice became clearer and more distinct. And the children sort of embedded a way of showing that they had a sense of belonging when they were with these adults. And with engagement with this reflective tool that was developed, the educators for the first time actually realised that voice really was absolutely there in pedagogy every day, and it should be seen more and it should be valued. It also spotlights the fact that the interactions like the one on the screen at the moment were incredibly rare in terms of everydayness. Some children, so the little girl in the image there was there 5 days a week, so really did receive a lot of contact and a lot of close connection. But like I said earlier, children who maybe were infrequent attenders got less of this, which meant they only maybe receive one-on-one care during a nappy change, for example, which in an 8 to 10 hour day, we need to question whether that's all right, and if we're happy with that as society, to know that children get infrequent contact with educators. So, thinking about voice and how else we could find it in terms of its agency, voice manifested as humour and playfulness. So here in the two images, you've got Richie, obviously not his real name, his agentic disposition thriving in these connected moments of intersubjective exchange. For not just for Richie, but for all the babies, these moments really drew them out into the nursery, revealing their humour and connecting with the strength of voice that their parents had spoken about in interviews about how playful they were or cheeky they were. And very important here was the responses of the educator. The fact that they responded playfully. You can see Joanne there tickling Richie. Obviously, again, not real names, but it seemed to instill confidence in the babies and validate their presence, resulting in this interconnectedness of voice patterning. And also it established a history. So it established real evidence that they were bringing together and bridging together and creating a relationship. And there were times across sort of the week where they would go back to these moments together and reenact the playful tickling or the sort of physicality together. So the educators stayed and they invested time in playing and seeing and lingering in these moments with babies. And as a result, voice emerged to be interconnected, complex, confident, and very dynamic. And these rituals and familiar patterns of communication really was essential for the children in developing a sense of trust and bonding, and also that sense of belonging, reassuring them that they were absolutely part of this baby room community. There were also elements of agency being displayed through voice, where children's connections were maybe under threat, or they were feeling potentially jealous of other children. So if we think here, if we look here, sorry, that we've got Yolanda, who is her key person, Lucy, is cuddling up with another child, and you can see her approach and really demonstrate intentional motive here. She's leaning in, she's displaying comforting behaviours and keen to kind of really engage the eye contact and physicality with Lucy. When that doesn't necessarily give her the effect and the sort of results that she wants, she moves to hitting the other child on the head with a toy, which obviously then creates a rupture for Lucy and the other child, which means actually she puts the other child down, and Yolanda gets what she was hoping for, which is physical and emotional contact with Lucy. So it might be a familiar scenario for any educators listening in terms of trying to share your attention again with over sort of more than one or two children. So it's very important, I guess, that we also recognise the dimensions and maturity of emotions that can be demonstrated through baby's voice as well. We can also see voice and agency demonstrated or conceptualised by adults as a challenging behaviour. This is Frank here, again, not his real name, and the reflective part of the project really brought to light the fact that there were times in the settings where babies to the adults were frustrating and they didn't understand the behaviours that the babies were displaying, and it just caused difficulties in the setting when they weren't doing what the adults wanted them to do. And this is a prime example where Frank was increasing the stress, supposedly, and sort of the challenges for staff during a snack time. And he spent most of his time staring the whole time at the adults, climbing up on furniture, pushing furniture around, and all the time the adults would respond, "Please, Frank, sit down," and sort of he would always comply. He would always sit back down again, but would always jump back up and start moving around. And Alma, his key person, noted that actually the noisier it is in the room, the more his vocalizing has increased. And what she means there is the way that he's behaving. It's like he's saying, "I'm still here, don't forget me, I'm still here." He does eventually comply and eat his snack, but it takes an adult to come and sit with him. So again, it reiterates the fact that the importance of connecting physically and being available to babies really is vital to their voice kind of contributions in nurseries. I just wanted to share quickly some reflections from the educators as well, evidencing this kind of element of stress, I think, that is often an undercurrent in many baby rooms and settings in sort of in England. So it's good that we have a team, otherwise it's carnage. Sometimes we can have 5 screaming babies and only a few staff. One child might cry, and then when you put them down, and then one staff member might be already doing nappies, or one clearing up from lunch. It's really, really hard, but we just have to get through it and deal with it. That's just the way it is. And then when they've gone through a process of reflection, that moving out of the room to reflect using video footage, they've had a sort of a moment of interillumination, as Bakhtin would call it. They didn't actually realise, or they'd maybe forgotten, how important they were to the children. So Lucy says here, "You don't realise what an impact you're having on them until you watch it back." I add value to their day with cuddles and smiles, and I'm 100% making a difference to him here. So I think that's vital in terms of repositioning voice, not just for babies actually, but also for educators too. So the barriers that were highlighted in terms of seeing voice was that every voice is unique and distinct, as we would expect, and it embodies the whole of the child, the whole body. So it takes time to learn about that child and to understand who they are and how they communicate. Time is needed to slow down and to stop, to be with babies in these connective interactions that we need, that the child needs, and we need as well. Institutional pressures and demands and a faster pedagogy seems to be rooted in sort of an organisational culture. And I really found that educators felt they lacked permission to be with babies and just to stop and slow down and really embrace those sustained interactions. They felt they were not shown to be busy enough in that respect. And there's absolutely conflicting political and institutional and personal motives within the constructs of voice, which we don't have time to go into today. So what are the implications then for babies and their development and agency? So we need to think about what we know around neuroscience, for example. We know the importance for brain development in terms of relationships, in terms of offering loving and sort of sustained care. It does affirm what we know already about relationships and how important they are, but it also raises questions, my study, around the systems that are in place and whether they are really ready and optimizing the opportunity for babies' voices to really be demonstrated, and whether their participatory rights are really being centralized as well. So conversations around what's the richest culture for babies, how can we optimize care? We want to think about the fact that adult ratios, however small they are in comparison and how sort of favourable they are in comparison to Europe, we need to think about it still elevates stress. It still expects educators to share the attention across a number of different babies. And it also brings us a sense of the educator feeling not good enough, but also at times the baby not feeling good enough. So, for example, the image to the right of your screen is Taylor, a little girl who did draw in her key person for an interaction, but not for a sustained amount of time. And actually what happened was she wandered around following the educator around the room, only for the educator to have to deal with another sort of incident. So she just occupied and self-soothed herself with her muzzy from home. And I think that's a really emotive image, just to think, is that good enough? Does that baby feel good enough to belong in that moment? I think what was abundantly clear in the study as well, just before I come to an end, that the educators worked incredibly hard. They were absolutely committed, they were passionate, and they really loved the children. There was no question of that at any point. But really what challenged their stamina and their ability to see voice and to recognise it as a real visual part of their pedagogy every day was, like I've said, the systems and cultures that diverted their attention all the time away from being with babies, which is what a lot of them went into working in early years to be. They wanted to work with children and be with them. And furthermore, there were times where they were sharing just that they were just exhausted from holding and containing the emotions of the babies, particularly during times of settling in, where there is often crying and misaligned communication as well. And of course, we know there is a recruitment and retention crisis in the sector as well. So often staff shortages really inhibited opportunities for voice to be found. So there are real opportunities to reflect and to think about what is it that babies require and how can we combat these issues within the sector. So just to optimise conditions for babies, we want to make sure, I would suggest that we ensure that we support settings to review the spaces for babies, to find sustainable strategies to maintain small group sizes. Ideally, no more than 6 babies in a group size would be optimal, working on a 1:3 ratio, not larger rooms with sort of 18 babies in. It just doesn't work. Some proper investment for workforce education, particularly with a focus around the emotional aspects of working with babies and uplifting child development knowledge and responsive caregiving around voice. Bridging the gap between research disciplines, and this is something I'm super passionate about in terms of bridging the gap between health disciplines and care disciplines, and also thinking about policy. and how that works. There's so much rich research going on in all of our disciplines. Actually bringing that together and sharing that in an ethically appropriate way with educators in early years is hugely important. And like I've just mentioned, ensuring that we find new ways of generating data, whether that's through visual methodologies in an ethically appropriate way. Establishing sustainable and realistic investment to prioritise high quality delivery around relational care, and also prioritise investment for all babies. In England, we've obviously got new funding coming in for families, working families, but what about people on lower income? Okay, are we really getting the right support in place for babies' voices there, and also for families as well? So just a few things just to finish with. So this is taken directly from my PhD. As a society, we remain morally and ethically and mutually answerable to babies. We are each closely bound in association with everything else, everything in the great chain of being. And we are absolutely accountable for the political blind spots that we create or are created. So what I want us to think about as we sign off today is actually, if we are really promoting babies' rights as citizens, are we ensuring that their voices are valued and respected, not just in early childhood, but beyond that? And actually, if they are not truly being seen, and perhaps are they being overshadowed by political or other cultural forces, then what are those long-term implications on their developmental outcomes? Because I think there is a conversation to be had across society around that. Okay, so that brings me to the end. I've just put some further reading up, a pamphlet that I developed with the Froebel Trust around my work, and also links there to one of my research papers and the thesis as well. But thank you very much for sharing, for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared. I'm just going to hand back to Michael.